G'day, it's Evan from Lux BMX here. Today I'm going to talk about drivetrains and chain alignment. We get a lot of questions about noisy drivetrains. Probably one of the topics that doesn't really get addressed is the actual chain alignment itself and how to isolate and identify the issues. So essentially with chain alignment, you're talking about your orientation between your front and your rear sprockets and how they line up. Quite commonly you find there's a little bit of variance. It can be a little bit and it doesn't matter too much, but you'll find if you've got, a bit of a noisy drivetrain and something sort of catching, sometimes that can be the case. So it can be a little bit out. The topic that doesn't really get addressed is that a lot of companies don't base any chain line or specific chain line spacing. So it can be a little bit hard to determine your chain line sometimes. The easiest way to kind of work it out or have a look at it is try and pretty much stand behind the back of the bike and look straight down the chain itself. You'll find if you're really close, it gets a little bit distorted, but if you put yourself a little bit further back, you can sometimes see if your chain alignment is out. Now, from that, identifying it and isolating it, really you have to measure to get a really clear picture. So on freestyle bikes, you have very minimal adjustment in your cog spacing itself, with a one-piece driver that is. So your tooth profile is in exactly the same space, per the hub itself. Something like these guys, this is an Odyssey hub here. Essentially, there's a bit of variance between different brands, but if you're basically measuring from the inner face of the dropout and the center of the tooth itself. So this one measures at around 12.5 millimeters. If you've got a hub spacing of 110 millimeters, half of that would be 55, so that'd be your center point of your hub. So taking 12.5 off 55 will leave you with 42.5 millimeters for your chain line. If you therefore then go to the front and then you're measuring from the center of the seat tube to the top of the tooth profile, you basically want to get as close as you can to the 42.5 millimeters. So with this one, it's pretty much bang on. So if you found that you're a little bit out, a little bit in on that, then you can adjust with your front sprocket with that. So it's relatively easy process with a freestyle bike. You've also got to just bear in mind your clearance from your tooth and your stay there. Obviously, there's only so far you can go in, but for the most part, you do have room there. Cool, so when you're looking at a race bike, there's a few little differences on how the chain line works. You do have a little bit more adjustment, especially if you've got a cassette style cog on the back where you can adjust your rear spacing, so it does give you a little bit more room to play with. More often than not, you actually have more adjustment in the rear than you do in the front with your front set up with a spider and a crankset like this. So the rules are the same as far as working out where your chain line needs to be. But one thing that we probably get a lot of inquiries about is tight and loose spots. Unfortunately, just the nature in the way that you have a drivetrain assembly, the more moving parts you've got, the more components essentially, the more chances that you might get a little bit of variance in your chain line. So if you do find that you've got a bit of a tight and loose spot, obviously trying to isolate where it is. If it's on the front chainring, it'll be on the same point on the rotation there. If it's sort of sporadically around, it could be a link in the chain, or it could be the timing with your rear sprocket as well. As I said, sometimes it can be hard to get it completely out, but if you make sure you've got a nice straight chain line, it'll sort of alleviate or mitigate any accentuation of that tight and loose spot. So yeah, but the principles are the same. Another thing to really make sure of when you are checking your chain line is that your wheel is in nice and straight in the dropout. So if the wheel's a little bit kicked off to the side, then your cog is obviously going to be on a different plane. So if you've got that nice and straight, that'll definitely help. So it's one more thing to check with your chain lines. So when it comes to noisy drivetrains, a race bike, you generally have less issues in regards to the chain on the teeth profile itself. The more teeth you've got on the cog, the smoother it generally is because it's supported by more teeth as it goes around the cog itself. Another thing, I guess, when you are looking at tooth profiles specifically, if you're looking at the teeth, some of them are quite sharp. A sharper tooth will actually give you a little bit more kind of leeway when it comes to chain line, because the chain can sort of hit it on a bit of an angle, so that makes it a little bit smoother sometimes, but you do find that they will wear out faster, whereas a tooth that has a squarer profile will last longer, but you'll find that if there's any variance in your chain line, then it'll be noisier in that regard too. It sort of catches on the side. Cool. So on a freestyle bike, because you have such a small drivetrain, having a smaller sprocket, you find that there is a chance for it to feel a little bit rougher, because you've, say, a 9-tooth drive, you've only got 4 or 5 teeth engaged at any moment. So the chain essentially kinks a lot easier. So if we look at this fly sprocket, for instance, you can see the teeth are really quite squared off, which a lot of companies are doing these days because it does prolong the life of the tooth. They tend to be a lot stiffer, a lot stronger. But you will find that if there's any variance in chain line, that because of these corners here, the chain can sort of catch it and ride up a lot more. If you've got a sprocket like this guy, it gives you a little bit more leeway, essentially. So as you have some variance in your hub spacing or your rear cog spacing, there's obviously going to be some variance in your front chainring spacing when you're looking at your bottom bracket widths, the crank offsets, the bottom bracket spacing itself. So it's a bit of a balancing act when it comes to setting it up. But most companies you'll find will be working between a 41 to a 45 mil chain line. There's no standardisation across the industry, but you kind of just have to be aware of it. You can understand it once you work it out once you understand it. So that's some basic principles for chain alignment and how to identify any issues. If you have any questions, hit us up in the comments or email us at help@luxbmx.com. Thanks for watching.